The execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger was no ordinary act of medieval justice. It was a calculated dismemberment of body identity and memory, a performance staged with cruel precision, not to simply punish a traitor, but to annihilate a man so thoroughly that even the whisper of his name might curdle the blood of anyone who dared challenge the crown, or more dangerously, control it. If you want more true stories, history tried to forget executions, betrayals, psychological torment hidden beneath royal crowns. Make sure to subscribe. He was not a king by title, but in the final years of Edward II's reign, Hugh Despenser was England's shadow monarch, wielding unchecked power behind the throne. His enemies were legion, his crimes allegedly treason, sodomy and corruption, but the truth, as ever, is more disturbing. Hugh Despenser wasn't executed because he broke the law. He was executed because he had become the law. When he was finally captured, he wasn't tried, he was displayed, marched in chains through jeering crowds, bound in the same iron he had once used to cage his own enemies. What followed was one of the most sadistic executions ever recorded in English history, an anatomically detailed act of public revenge where death wasn't the endgame but a slow and deliberate unveiling. Contemporary chroniclers described the horror in clinical detail: castration, disembowelment, the severing of limbs, while life still clung to the shattered body, and hovering over it all like smoke from the execution fire was a single unspoken message: this is what happens to those who grow too close to power. But what did Hugh Despenser do to deserve such fate? Who was he, and why did all of England cheer as his intestines were pulled from his writhing form? To understand that, we must go back to the royal court of a weak king, a queen pushed too far, and a man who reached too high only to be torn apart piece by living peace. To the casual eye, Hugh Despenser the Younger was just another nobleman's son of a loyal retainer husband to the king's niece, a man of decent lineage but hardly destined for greatness. But beneath the polished surface, Hugh was something far more dangerous, ambitious, brilliant, and utterly without restraint. He was born into a world where proximity to power was everything, and where betrayal was not a sin but a currency. By the early 1320s, England was bleeding from the inside. The reign of King Edward II, weak, indecisive, and disdained by his barons, had descended into chaos. His reliance on male favorites, first Piers Gaveston, then Despenser, had transformed the English court into a crucible of jealousy, paranoia, and backroom vengeance. Despenser wasn't content to merely advise the king. He sought dominion, and Edward, starved of loyalty, gave it to him. Land titles, access to the royal treasury, legal immunity. Despenser seized it all, not through war but through manipulation. So deaf it would make a modern politician blush. He orchestrated the exile of rivals, seized estates, rewrote inheritances. He weaponized the crown's authority for private gain, becoming the architect of a tyranny executed by royal decree. But power, when taken so nakedly, attracts its own gravity, pulling enemies from every shadow. The nobility seated commoners starved. Queen Isabella, once loyal to her husband, now found herself humiliated, politically neutered, and surrounded by a court she no longer controlled. And at the center of it all, like rot at the root of a great tree, was Hugh Despenser. He didn't merely rule. Beside Edward, he consumed the king's authority, leaving even Parliament cowed. He read the king's letters, drafted his speeches, intercepted messages from foreign courts. The king became a mouthpiece, a body through which Despenser operated those who spoke Against him disappeared some were. Imprisoned some were executed others. Simply vanished his cruelty wasn't. Reckless it was strategic every act of. Violence reinforced the illusion that. The monarchy was untouchable that. Resistance was suicidal yet in reality. Despenser had turned the crown into a hostage and England into a prison and. Still he wanted more he wasn't satisfied. With dominance he wanted immortality his. Ambition stretched into the metaphysical. He bribed chroniclers to polish his reputation forced monks to sing prayers. In his name this wasn't governance it was a slow-moving coronation of a man who wore no crown but controlled the throne. But there's a rule in power that never breaks when a man begins to believe he cannot fall the world ensures that he does and so while Despenser basked in borrowed royalty a storm gathered beyond the walls of Edward's hollow court a queen sharpening her knives a rebellion swelling in secret a reckoning that would leave Despenser not just defeated but unmade because in the end they wouldn't simply execute him they would destroy every part of him so thoroughly it would be impossible to put him back together even in memory by 1325 the Kingdom of England was not merely fractured it was rotting from the top down the peasants were starving there. Crops levied to fund a king's retreat from reality and a court consumed by decadence nobles once bound by loyalty to the crown now whispered in guarded corridors about open rebellion even. Parliament a body designed to advise not resist found itself increasingly frozen out its voice drowned beneath the rising tide of one man's tyranny and that man was Hugh Despenser he had become a lightning rod for every grievance every humiliation every tax and torture and mutilation carried out in the king's name his private enemies now included half the country's nobility but it was his relationship with Queen Isabella that would ultimately seal his fate once a loyal French Princess Isabella had endured a decade of emotional exile in her own court her status her access to power even her dignity all were systematically stripped by the rise of Despenser she had been publicly disrespected her household dissolved her children used as leverage by her husband and his favorite but what Despenser failed to understand was that Isabella had teeth in 1325 she was sent on a diplomatic mission to France officially to negotiate peace between England and her homeland but she never returned in exile she did not weep she did not beg. She built an army she aligned herself with Roger Mortimer a powerful noble who had once been imprisoned by Edward and Despenser together they formed an alliance both personal and political a rebellion made not of peasants but of nobles mercenaries and foreign allies. They didn't want to dethrone Edward not. Yet they wanted Despenser and in 1326 they returned they didn't storm castles. They dismantled loyalty town by town. Noble by noble Isabella and Mortimer advanced through England without resistance Despenser's name had become so toxic that even royalists chose flight over loyalty Edward and Despenser once untouchable were reduced to fugitives fleeing the very country they ruled. Despenser's downfall wasn't just a military defeat it was a total collapse of legitimacy no allies came to his defense no one mourned his flight the same courtiers who once bowed before him now looked away pretending they'd never spoken his name when he was finally captured gaunt filthy dressed in the stolen clothes of a commoner it was not in battle it was in disgrace. He was dragged from a monastery where he tried to claim sanctuary not as a lord but as a criminal in hiding shivering with fear and the people Rejoiced in London they lit bonfires in the streets they danced for a moment it seemed the entire kingdom had held its breath until Despenser was caught his name once spoken in fear was now spat with venom echoed by a public eager not just for justice but for vengeance but what came next was no ordinary reckoning. Because Queen Isabella and her allies didn't want a trial they wanted a lesson. One that would be carved not into parchment or stone but into the living flesh of Hugh Despenser himself. There are ways to kill a man and then there are ways to unmake him. When Hugh Despenser the Younger was finally captured in October 1326 he was no longer the towering figure who once commanded kings. He was a fugitive, barefoot and caked in mud, disguised in the robes of a monk, clinging to a false sanctuary in a Welsh abbey, but no sanctuary would hold not for him. He was dragged from the altar steps by royal troops and chained like livestock thrown into the same prison carts he had once used to haul his enemies to their deaths. Gone were the silks and the royal audience, in their place filth, iron and the stench of fear. From that moment his death began, not with blades but with ritualized humiliation. He was paraded across England not as a prisoner of war, but as a trophy of vengeance. In town after town crowds gathered to see him, not to judge a man but to witness the fall of an era, a living embodiment of the corruption that had suffocated the realm. And at every stop the ritual deepened. His beard was forcibly shaved, a symbolic emasculation, his robes torn from him and replaced with a coarse tunic, deliberately chosen to expose the bones of his starvation. He was strapped to a horse backwards, his face toward the tail, a final indignity that reduced him to spectacle, not feared, not respected. Laughed at chroniclers, note that he wept openly, that the iron chains cut into his wrists and ankles, that he vomited from fear when told of what awaited him. This wasn't a legal process, it was a slow psychological crucifixion. They marched him to Hereford, the seat of Queen Isabella's temporary court. She didn't wait in a throne room, she waited in the open among nobles who had lost sons and land and honor. At Despenser's hands her face, they say, betrayed no joy, only cold purpose. There would be no trial. Pre-written sentence was read aloud. Treason, sodomy, theft, war crimes, consorting with the devil, each charge more performative than the last. No evidence was presented, none was needed. This was not justice, it was theater, and the script had already been written. Despenser, now pale and trembling, was dragged by horses to the scaffold, prepared in the marketplace. But this was not a normal execution platform, it was taller, wider, deliberately built to show every gruesome act to the crowd who had been summoned from across the county. And as he stood barely conscious from exhaustion and terror, Despenser made one last plea, to speak, to confess, to beg, but his words were drowned out by the trumpets and drums, an orchestra of public hatred designed to announce not just death but obliteration. What followed was not execution, it was ritualized annihilation. The executioner did not begin with a beheading that would be mercy. Instead he began with fire. They hung Despenser by the neck, but not to kill, only to bring him to the edge of death. As he dangled choking, they released him. He collapsed, barely breathing, only to be laid out on the wooden platform where the real sentence began. With knives, there are few historical records that describe a death in such explicit surgical cruelty as that of Hugh Despenser the Younger. Because this was not simply an act of execution, it was an act of performance. Warfare designed not to end a man's life, but to unravel his humanity piece by Deliberate peace under the eyes of a kingdom. The scaffold had been customuled for visibility, raised high above the marketplace in Hereford. Its surface was soaked with pitch, not for structural strength but to darken the wood so that the blood would show. They began with hanging, not to kill but to prime. Hugh was strung by the neck until his eyes rolled back, until his limbs twitched in reflexive terror. Then he was cut down, still alive barely, while he gasped for breath. The knives came next. First the castration, a symbolic mutilation. The executioner sliced off dispenser's genitals, holding them aloft like a trophy before tossing them into a fire built specifically so dispenser could watch his body burn before his eyes closed forever. Crowd reactions were mixed, some cheered, others vomited, but none looked away. Then came the disembowelment. Slowly, methodically, the executioner cut into dispenser's abdomen and began removing his intestines inch by inch, making sure the internal organs remained intact, a process that could prolong consciousness if the main arteries were not severed too quickly. Chronicles say he screamed, that his body twisted uncontrollably, and that his eyes locked onto Queen Isabella for a moment. Not pleading but in disbelief. This wasn't justice, it was ritual revenge, codified into public memory. His intestines, still warm and steaming, were dragged from his body and fed into the same flames as his genitals. The executioner wore gloves, not to avoid gore but because the organs could still be dangerously hot from metabolic activity. Next came the heart. It was not removed quickly. The chest was split open slowly with a hatchet. The ribs cracked apart one by one, and when the heart was finally severed from the arteries, he may still have been conscious, just enough for the pain to register but not enough for speech. They burned it too. Only then did they allow the body to die completely, but even that death was not final, because the sentence had one more stage: dismemberment. The limbs were sawed off, not chopped, the bones splintered under the blade, arms, legs, hands, feet removed and wrapped in linen to be dispersed across England as visible warnings. One went to York, another to Bristol, a third to Northampton. His head, crowned with dried blood and still bearing the look of agony, was mounted on a spike at London Bridge. Travellers would see it rot, birds would pick at the eyes, children would point, and no one would forget. Each part of him was turned into a signal. This is what happens when a man reaches beyond the crown and dares to wear it in all but name. Dispensers' remains were never collected. There was no burial, no tomb, no prayers. He was not laid to rest. He was scattered like a disease the realm wanted to burn away. But there's one detail most accounts omit. When the executioner cleaned his tools that night, he reportedly asked to be paid in silence and never performed another royal execution again. Even he, butcher by trade, had seen enough. What happens when a kingdom dismembers a man? Not just kills him, not just ends his heartbeat, but deliberately scatters his flesh across the realm. It ceases to be an execution, it becomes a message etched into the landscape itself. The dismemberment of Hugh Despenser the Younger was not an afterthought. It was not excessive cruelty, it was policy, carefully crafted by the architects of rebellion to serve one overwhelming purpose: to ensure that no one for generations could rise to power as Despenser had, without remembering what it cost him. His head, blackened by drying blood and the heat of decomposition, was mounted on London Bridge, the primary gateway into the capital. Every merchant, every pilgrim, every noble who passed beneath it looked up, and when they did, they saw not just a skull but a warning. A monarch's whisper turned into a grin. Of death, but that wasn't enough. His limbs, arms, legs, hands were mailed to cities across England, nailed to gate. Houses and castle walls, flesh turned into frontier, a human body broken into a network of power reminders. This was not random York, where northern rebellions had once festered, Bristol, where Despenser had confiscated land, Dover, the gateway to France, a reminder to allies and enemies alike that traitors are not buried, they are displayed. Each location was chosen with precision, a kind of cartographic punishment. The body had become state propaganda, and it worked. In the months after Despenser's death, dozens of nobles who had once sided with Edward abandoned the king completely. Some retired from court life, others fled the country, terrified that the same theatrical brutality might one day fall on them. Even in death, Despenser remained powerful, not as a man but as a symbol of annihilation. But what's most revealing is what wasn't done. There were no prayers offered for his soul, no monks sent to retrieve his remains, no pardons issued posthumously. He was denied not justice but memory, and in medieval Europe, where the afterlife was a daily obsession, this was not just cruel, it was cosmic exile. To deny a man burial was to deny him resurrection. To cut his body to pieces was to cut his soul adrift, and to spread those pieces across a kingdom was to ensure that no one could gather them again. Centuries later, when chroniclers attempted to document the remains of Edward Tuscourt Despenser's records were curiously sparse. His name appeared, then vanished. His deeds recorded, then scratched out in some illuminated manuscripts. Entire pages had been scraped clean where his name had once appeared. Not only was he executed, he was erased. But history does not always obey erasure, because the horror of what was done to Hugh Despenser could not be hidden. It was etched into the cities that received his body, into the memories of the crowds that watched, into the whispered stories passed from father to son, mother to daughter. He had tried to carve himself into England. Instead, England carved itself into him. When Hugh Despenser's mutilated body was carted off in bloody fragments, King Edward II did not speak, not to the court, not to the clergy, not even, it is said, to himself, because by then Edward wasn't a monarch, he was a ghost who still breathed. Just weeks before he had reigned as King of England, now he was a fugitive in rags, watching the execution of his soul made flesh. The man who had been his voice, his shield, his shadow, and when Despenser screamed, Edward heard his own voice break inside him. He had been captured shortly after Despenser abandoned by his army, his baggage plundered, his authority in tatters. He did not resist. There were no final speeches, no declarations of defiance. Only a broken man dragged through the countryside he once ruled, bound in ropes. Instead of robes, his throne had been taken by the very woman he had once dismissed, Isabella, his queen, now the architect of his downfall. She did not execute him, she did something far worse. She made him irrelevant. Edward was stripped of his title in a carefully managed coup that avoided blood but not humiliation. He was forced to abdicate in favor of his own son, the young Edward III, who was barely 14. The ceremony was public, but Edward's presence was not. He abdicated from a prison cell. Contemporary accounts speak of a man who had become gray with silence. He refused food, refused sleep at night. He reportedly muttered prayers not to God but to Hugh. His name repeated like a broken hymn. Isabella knew better than to let him live freely. He was transferred to remote castles under heavy guard. But what happened to Edward next remains one Of medieval England's most haunting mysteries in September 1327, less than a year after Despenser's execution, Edward II was dead. The official cause natural illness, but whispers told another story of a red-hot poker of screams that echoed down stone corridors of a body too mutilated to display. Historians still debate whether this tale is legend or fact, but what's undeniable is this: Edward's death was every bit as silent as Despenser's had been loud. There was no royal funeral, no triumphal procession, no stained glass effigy. The man who had once ruled an empire was buried quietly under the supervision of guards. The final exhalation of a kingship smothered in its sleep. What Despenser's execution began, Edward's death completed a reign defined by indulgence, isolation, and favoritism had ended in disgrace, not with a final battle, not with a noble stand, but with a whisper, because sometimes the most devastating collapse doesn't happen with thunder, sometimes it ends with the sound of a crown being set down and not picked up again. The execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger may have ended with his body reduced to scorched fragments and severed limbs, but the real erasure began after he died. Because his enemies didn't just want him dead, they wanted him unremembered. In medieval England, legacy was currency. Noble lineages were traced in manuscripts, family trees inked into parchment by cloistered monks. But Hugh Despenser, once a man who controlled the king, the court, and half the kingdom, vanishes from many of these records like a disease airbrushed out of a portrait. It wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate purge. Royal clerks were instructed to remove his name from surviving documents. His titles were declared null and void. Court historians were warned not to praise him or even mention him. Chroniclers scratched out entire entries, leaving blank spaces and annals where his deeds had once been recorded. His estates were redistributed, his seal broken, his coat of arms obliterated from heraldry like a smudge wiped off glass. Even art played a role. Portraits of Edward II were altered, faces softened, figures rearranged to remove the specter of Despenser standing behind the throne. Tapestries depicting court scenes were rethreaded to exclude his likeness. It was history rewritten, not by ink but by silence. And yet some things refused to stay buried. Fragments remained, letters, often ensign, that referenced him by nickname, the king's shadow or the false regent. Monastic chronicles smuggled in references, coded insults describing a man with too much appetite for power. French diplomats, less constrained by English censorship, wrote gleeful accounts of his fall, detailing the cleansing fire that followed his disembowelment. But even these were viewed as curiosities, not canon. For centuries Despenser was a ghost in the footnotes, neither hero nor villain, just omitted a blank space in royal history where something too shameful, too grotesque had once stood. That changed in the 19th and 20th centuries, when historians, armed with modern archival methods and less fear of royal retribution, began to excavate the truth. They uncovered forged documents, inconsistent dates, royal cover-ups. Manuscripts that had been corrected were analyzed under ultraviolet light, revealing Despenser's name faintly scraped beneath the surface. Marginalia in abbey ledgers began to resurface, with monks scribbling in Latin, he ruled the king, or the one who burned. What emerged was a figure far